the biggest skill that you can develop as a gardener is to observe, and to accept feedback.
Yeah.
To grow like robust, healthy seedlings, it's better if you actually do have a light. Your cool season crops will germinate at a lower temperature than your warm season crops.
That's good. That's a good tip. Like to kind of think about it that way.
Be that happiest little seedling you ever seen.
There you go.
Yeah. All right, Kareen, welcome back to the show. How's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, I know. Round 2.
Yes.
It's always exciting to have someone come back on.
Mm-hmm.
Last time we had a great conversation in your garden.
Back.
That was really fun.
When it was sunny and things were growing.
Yeah.
Not 3 feet of snow outside.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's getting crazy out here in Montana, guys, right now. We've been struggling with the snow.
Yeah.
But, despite that, you got to start thinking about the garden because greener seasons are coming.
Yes.
It's going to happen quicker than we know, or faster than we know, you know.
Days are already getting longer.
Yeah.
Just a little bit,
We're really excited. And we'll get into some more gardening stuff today. That's why we brought the expert on. But we have had a good amount of new listeners since last time. So I figured, give you the floor quick to just explain who you are and like what you do with Broken Ground Permaculture, your mission.
Sure.
Yeah. It'd be good to hear.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so my name is Kareen Erbe, and I have a small business here in Bozeman, Montana called Broken Ground, where I teach people how to grow their own food and become more self-reliant. And I do that through consultations, edible garden design services, and also various different workshops that I offer along with my kind of signature resilient homestead program. So I love working with clients both in person and remotely, and just so appreciative that I get to do this kind of work.
Yeah, no, I think you do an amazing job. And you also have a YouTube channel, right?
I do, yeah.
For people to check out.
Yeah, if people are interested at all in just growing food, and I'm not a forager as much, but I forage in my own garden. Or if they're interested in creating food forests or growing vegetables, that's kind of my jam.
Yeah. Which is a super important thing. I think the food forest, especially, I always look at people's gardens and I'm like, well, you got so many cool plants here, but none of them are edible. And you could have a bunch of edible plants in here that also look beautiful, or maybe even native and are really low maintenance because of that. So it's cool that you're out there spreading the word.
Yeah.
I love it.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I know if you do live in Bozeman, you sometimes do like group harvests, right? Community kind of harvests where people can come and help you pick stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I do regular volunteer days during the growing season, and then we'll have oftentimes potlucks or work parties for specific times of year, depending on it, depending on how big our harvests are, how much help I need. Definitely needed help with the buffalo berries a couple seasons ago because they're just a little bit hard to harvest. But
those are native, right?
Yes.
So I actually want to learn how to forage those because I know they're out in the wild.
Yeah.
And that's kind of cool. So you are foraging on your property.
Yeah, I am. Yes. Creating things to forage. Yes, basically.
That's awesome. Well, we just mentioned it's snowing outside. It's February here now in Montana, and a lot of people are probably huddled up in their house and hopefully already starting to think about, what's next for the gardening season and doing some garden prep, planning their garden, and a big step or a big part of that is the seed starting. So, and there's a lot of ways you can start seeds, I would say, and there's a lot of tips and tricks and a lot of, experience to be gained. I think that's true for us.
Oh, yeah.
We've only started seeds a few times and had mixed success. So we figured, why not bring the expert in, bring you in to chat about that a bit. So we'd love to start with the seed starting today. So to just kind of like back up, Like, why should we even start seeds? Like, what's the big benefit?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is economic for sure. You
Yeah.
know, that a packet of seeds, which costs maybe $3.50 or something like that, $4, versus that has, 50 or 100 potential tomato plants in there
Mhm.
is going to be way less expensive than the $4 or $5 that you pay for a seedling.
That's a good point. Like going to, what is it, Lowe's? What are some common
Or
spots?
at
The
your
Any
garden
garden
garden,
barn.
yeah,
center.
any
Yeah.
garden, yeah, any garden,
Coldy goes to
yeah.
the hardware
Yeah.
store. What?
It's the only thing I
Go
could think
local,
of.
folks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Go
you're right.
local.
but
You're right.
But yeah, so that's an expense. If you, for example, I'll grow, upwards of 50 tomato plants a year, and so that can
oh,
get
wow.
expensive versus you buy a few seed packets and then you're able to, grow 50 or 70 tomato plants
Right.
with maybe a $15 investment or something like
Right.
that. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is you can determine the varieties that you want to grow. So that is also part of it. That rather than whatever the garden center has or your local grower has or something, you can choose. You can go through the seed catalogs and choose, things that you want to experiment with, or that you just really use as a family. So
Mhm.
those are two main reasons. And then of course, there are some things that we have to put in as seedlings and can't just put it in as seeds being in a cold climate. But those are
Like directly into the ground, you're saying.
yes. Yeah. And I think that also, seed starting is if you're really jonesing for things growing and plants growing during this time of year, when there's just still 3 feet of snow on the ground, it's really a way to kind of get into gardening and feel a little bit of that infusion of living things. I'm
Yeah,
stewarding living things right now. So especially with our long winter, it's a nice thing to do as well.
definitely.
Yeah.
What is your preferred method for starting seeds indoors?
Indoors, in terms of the containers and the all of that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. So yeah, I brought a couple little show and tell things for you. One of my preferred methods is this tray, and
Okay.
you can see by how it looks that I've used it a lot. I've had this thing for over 10 years. So I'm not the biggest fan of plastic, obviously, but I did buy this because it's super useful in terms of getting a seed starting mix that's sterile, like your typical seed starting mix, putting it in here, and then being able to,
I'll hold
um,
it for you.
fill these up. But then one row is one kind of tomato, say. And the
Right.
good thing about this is you put, a series of tomato seeds in here and then you cover them with that seed starting mix, is that you're not losing a lot of seeds either. So before putting them in a bigger container, right, you make sure that they're germinating first here, and then you'd move them to another container
Transplant them, yeah.
rather than, using a bigger cell, and maybe using up all that soil and those seeds not germinating.
Right.
Interesting.
So,
Okay, yeah. So
yeah.
you'd rather go smaller cell just to save on soil too, or substrate, whatever you want to
Yep.
call it.
Yep.
Yeah, because and that's important though, because the seeds, the plants when they start, they don't really need
A
like
lot.
any special soil, right?
Yeah. The reason you start with the seed starting mix is because you want to make sure you're not bringing any kind of disease into it. Small seedlings are very susceptible to any kind of disease or fungal
Mhm.
disease that you might have. And so starting with the sterile seed starting mix, getting the seeds to germinate until they have their true leaves, and then stepping them up into larger containers,
Mhm.
saves soil. Probably, make sure that you're making the most use of space
Right.
too, because that might be a limiting factor. You're usually starting your seeds indoors, and so you might have limited space. So it saves space, and overall, it once you step them up into the bigger containers, then you're using something like a potting soil that has more nutrient in it.
Mhm.
Right.
And you can also use, cells like this. I've started seeds in cells like this as well. And
So
so
they're a
that's
little bigger.
also an
That's what,
option.
like,
So they're a little bigger.
is that an inch by inch?
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that way they can stay in here slightly longer. In here, they can't stay for very long.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any problems with the roots being tangled in the first one?
So with these, so tomatoes are incredibly forgiving.
Mhm.
You know, when I think about what I start from seed are things like tomatoes, peppers, sometimes broccoli, oftentimes leeks and onions, right? But I usually start my peppers and tomatoes in this particular tray. And even if you have to tease apart the the roots,
Mm.
tomatoes are so forgiving. You put them in a bigger 4-inch container and they'll take off.
Okay.
But one other option is if you don't want to use, again, like not the biggest fan of plastic, but these are some, I purchased this one, but some of the other ones that I've gotten for free or from other gardeners. You can use what's called a soil blocker.
Mhm.
And that's where you don't use any kind of container. It just kind of squishes the soil into like a little square, and then you use that, and you can start seeds that way. The advantage of that is that the roots are allowed to kind of
Mhm.
expand,
Gotcha.
and so that's also an option. If you don't already have supplies,
Mhm.
you might want to go that route. But it's also those soil blockers can be a little finicky too.
I first heard about those actually at your potluck, the one
Mhm.
I went to,
Mhm.
and yeah, some people were just super in love with
Yeah.
the soil blocks,
Yeah.
and like, so basically, I watched a video after, and this is like the way it kind of works is you prepare the soil, you put them in this device, right? It's a
Mhm.
little like metal device, and then it like presses this perfect little,
It's like a car
yeah,
crusher at a dump yard.
yeah, kind of like that in
Yeah.
A little
in miniature,
compressor.
yeah.
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 And then you have like a little block that stays together, and it looked cool.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that works pretty good.
And that works well too. So it kind of depends on what you want. The other option too, when I started out gardening, on a extreme budget, you can use yogurt containers and put little holes in them. You
Yeah.
can, you know,
Egg
little
cartons, right?
egg cartons
I
are an
was gonna ask you
option.
about that. Does that work pretty well, or have you like, what are your thoughts on it?
I think that if I were to choose, I would choose something like it's great that there's this egg carton that you can put directly into the ground, but that's only for certain things. Like you won't be able to grow a tomato seedling in an egg carton.
Mm.
Like you can start it, but then you're gonna have to step it up into
Just
a
because the roots
4-inch
aren't
pot.
strong enough to.
There's just not enough soil.
Okay.
There's not enough soil to start with that it's gonna grow into anything substantial. So, um, you can use the egg cartons, but depending on what seed you're starting, you're probably gonna have to step that up into a bigger container.
Right.
So, it's a great, I think it's great for that whole thing, but functionally, it's a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Um,
And then also, I wonder if they have like chemicals in them. Like there might be some in the paper, and
right. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be as concerned about that as I am. There's something also about the water retention and the
Mm.
cardboard and the soaking that makes it a bit awkward too, in terms of it, because you have to water it and then it
Right.
gets
Drenched.
drenched, and then it's harder. You might lose it and lose the integrity of the actual kind of container and the soil in it. So
right.
it's a little trickier, although I love the concept just
Yeah.
because you're reusing something that you already have.
Right.
But all of us, even if we're stalwart, low waste people, still have plastic containers wandering around.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
kind of inevitable in our society.
Well, and they're easy to clean, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned
Yeah.
that big part of the process is starting super sterile.
Yeah.
How do you usually go about that?
Yeah, you can clean like either with soap and water, or you can add a little bit of bleach if you want. What I find here is sometimes I will just do the soap and water just because we don't have a huge amount of diseases here. It would be different if we had more of a humid environment.
Mhm.
But we're pretty, we don't have as much of an issue
It's a
with
very
that.
dry
Yeah,
area, yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
Not a
yeah.
bunch of mold issues
Exactly.
probably and stuff like
Exactly.
that.
If there were that and there was humidity constantly, back east or something like that, then I would be way more concerned. But I've never had, using a sterile soil seed starting mix, I've never had a disease like persist or had issues with starting seedlings with regards to that.
Okay. So you clean your stuff,
Yep.
then you get the substrate, a cell starting mix. What does that usually look like?
It's usually, it comes in a bag, of
Mhm.
course. And it's usually just a seed starting mix, it'll say on there. So it's not a potting soil, it's not a garden soil. It's specifically for starting seeds. So you get that, you put it usually in, like, I'll put it in a 5-gallon bucket and I'll put water in there because you want to soak it quite a
Mm.
bit. That makes it easier than trying to spray it.
Afterwards.
Smart,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yeah.
that's smart.
So it gets some initial moisture in it. And then I'll move that into, say, a container like this. And you want to compact it down, right? And then make sure there's enough space, however much space depth you need, depending on how big the seed is. Then you just compact it all down in there. You put the seeds in. You then put another layer of soil mix on top, and then you water everything in. I usually use like a spray bottle because you don't want to use something too impactful that will kind of make the seeds fly out
Fly
Have
of
a
everywhere, yeah.
Russian
themselves.
roulette of
Right.
seeds.
Yeah, like,
Exactly.
Don't use your
Exactly.
hose at that
Right.
Yeah.
point.
Exactly.
No,
Or
that's
like a
good.
small little watering can or something like that. And then you just put them in there and put them under. One thing that I start with is actually this a heat mat. You can purchase a heat mat. Again, these are things where you don't have to have a heat mat. It does help,
Okay.
however, in terms of germination and the timing of germination. And again, these are things that, like, I've had this thing for 10 years, as you can
Right.
tell.
Yeah.
But these are kind of one-time purchases, hopefully, and then you use them for, most of your gardening career. And this has lasted that long. So you put the tray on top of this heat mat. Remember that seeds germinate based on moisture and temperature, not light,
Mhm.
right? So you can conceivably just have them on this heat mat and water them daily, and you don't have to have a light over top of them.
Interesting.
It's only until they germinate do you actually have to put the lights on.
So would you remove the heat pad at that point once they've germinated?
It depends. Oftentimes I'll leave it just depending on where you're starting your seeds
Mm.
because they do benefit from some warmth.
Okay.
You don't want it to get too hot, but they do benefit from some more, like, say you're in a basement. I oftentimes start my seeds in the basement.
Mhm.
So, they'll benefit from having that additional warmth.
Is there kind of one set general temperature that's best for all seeds, or does it kind of vary?
It depends.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually on this actual mat, it shows you kind of germination rates
Whoa.
of different germination times, in terms of days.
Mhm.
But also you've got to think, right? Your cool season crops will germinate at a lower temperature than your warm season crops.
That's
Right.
good. That's a good tip. Like to kind of
Yeah.
think about it that way.
Yeah,
Like
just
a
like
general rule.
outside, if you were to
Yep.
put your cool season crops out, you can put them out earlier than you can your warm season crops. If you put
Right.
out your warm season seeds that you direct seed in the soil too early, then they won't germinate and they'll just rot in the soil.
That's smart. Yeah, that's a good tip.
Mhm.
Yeah, I bought one of those heat
Mhm.
mats too, and I think it made a difference.
Yes. Yeah.
For sure. And it wasn't that, it was like $20-$30.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a worthwhile investment, I think, just in terms of otherwise what you're doing is you're generating heat from above with the lights,
Right.
right? Which is not as effective as heat from below.
Right.
Once they have germinated, is it 100% necessary to have a light, or can they kind of be in a window somewhere and get similar results?
Right. That's It's better to have them have a light overhead.
Okay.
With partly because, say, at this time of year when you're trying to germinate seeds, you're not getting a huge amount of sunlight.
Right.
And so you'll find that the seedlings will start to reach for the light.
Just like my houseplants.
Right,
They're all
exactly.
reaching in here.
Exactly. Like, where is it? So I think to grow like robust, healthy seedlings, it's better if you actually do have a light. You can use your windowsill, especially if you're not starting until March
Mm.
or end of March. But it's just not going to create as robust a seedling. But you don't have to buy like a grow light. I used to start seeds when we were in a rental and we had kind of limited money and limited space. There were 2 shop lights that I found in the garage, and I just used those, but I bought like sunlight bulbs.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Specifically sunlight bulbs for those, what are these fluorescent shop lights.
Right.
It is
essentially.
mind-blowing to me. I work in my garage with no real light, so I'm gonna do that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna grow myself like a plant. Be that happiest little seedling you ever seen.
There you go.
Yeah.
So starting them with that light on top of them, of course, very close to them.
That's a question I had because that I think that is you can read a lot about like how far away should the light be from the seedlings, and I think it also like depends on the type of plant maybe, or
It
do you have a
depends
general
on how
rule?
big or how much they grow, but I'll put them like, 2-3 inches, and as they grow taller, then I move it up, right? So
Okay.
I used to have like a small seed starting setup that was just shop lights on chains that and little hooks. There were little hooks and the chains, and you could just move them up as the plants grew
Okay.
up. And that's probably the best option, so that there's, a couple inches. And that's, again, one of those things like in gardening all the time. You're constantly like, try something and accept the feedback. You're looking and observing. And if you notice that they are getting burned or something, then you can lift them up a little bit higher.
Yeah, if they are drying out a bit, it's probably then the light because they're still indoors.
Right.
It's not like the temperature's fluctuating too much.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a light issue. But, I'll start out with this and the lights will be, right here with it, as
Right.
close as I can get it.
So like 4
Yeah.
inches.
Yeah. So things aren't trying to reach,
Okay.
for that light. Even if you have a light directly overhead and it's better than just on your windowsill, you still don't want them reaching too far
Right.
for that light.
Okay.
And then there are different types of lights. So I don't know, how much you've experimented with different ones, but I think there's like LED maybe or some, and then
Yeah, there are great LED grow lights out there, and they're a lot more efficient. So one of the main concerns that people have, and why sometimes I recommend just getting a fluorescent and then sunlight bulb, is, grow lights, just your typical grow light, draws a lot of energy. But I think they've gotten really much better. The industry has gotten better over the years in using LEDs, and so that makes for less energy consumption. And then you do have, those are more effective than the sunlight fluorescent light
bulbs. Yeah.
bulbs. But they're, I for the longest time just used the sunlight fluorescent bulbs.
Isn't there a type of light though you don't want to have super close to the plant? Have you heard of that?
Oh, I forget now but you're right.
I remember reading something about that too. So if you're researching your lights out there, make
Right.
sure you pay attention to
Right.
that
Yeah.
because, don't want to. I just remember there vaguely being something about I forget which one it is too.
There's a spectrum,
Yeah.
right? That you want them, and that's why that sunlight bulb has that spectrum versus your like average cooler fluorescent light.
Yeah.
Your hospital lights.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
That,
Hospital
don't
lights
like
versus
them,
sunlight.
so plants also don't like them.
Yeah.
There's a reason for
Crazy.
that.
And then, with while we're on this topic of lights, you also the timing matters, right? Like how long you're keeping these lights on. Is there a general rule for this or is it?
I'm not sure if there is a general rule, but I typically turn them off at night when I go to bed.
Yeah,
Mm.
and it
You know,
works.
and turn them on in the morning. You can have them on all the time, right? Because then your plant is going to go it's going to grow that much quicker.
Right. It's gonna think it's Norway or
Right.
Alaska where
Exactly.
24
Sunlight is
hours is sunlight.
awesome.
And there can be too much UV, right,
Yeah.
that plants get. But seedlings, I've done it both ways. Sometimes when I've kept lights on because I've been late starting the seeds, so I need them to grow a little bit faster.
Got it.
But I kind of prefer, I think for energy, and I don't know why, just like put them to bed. I'm going to bed.
Tuck in the seedlings.
I like
I'm
that.
I'm not sure if scientifically there's any sense to that, but that's just how I like to do it.
So it sounds like there's some wiggle room. You can get away with things like
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah.
But you do want that I would say you want at least 8 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
how moist are you keeping the seedlings? Are you watering them every day, twice a day? How do you tell
Yeah,
when they need
well, it of course depends on the cell that it's in,
Uh-huh.
right? Like if it's in these small cells, then that's every day.
Right.
Right. If it's in a larger cell and there's a little bit more moisture, you might be able to get away with every second day. Once you step things up to 4-inch pots, definitely you don't have to water them every day.
Is there like a test to do, like a
You
finger
could,
test or something?
the soil likes to be kind of moist like a wrung out sponge. And so I would test that sometimes, but be careful. Like even though we're in a dry climate, there is a tendency, right, to overwater
Mhm.
seedlings, and then you can run into problems
Okay.
there. So just monitor them, but early on when they're in small cells, and especially before they've germinated, you
Mhm.
just want to water them every day.
Okay. And are you doing the spray bottle to water them every time, or is it just kinda dump and go?
Yeah. It depends. Yeah. So spray bottle ideally, but once your hand gets cramped, then sometimes I'll take the spray bottle and just pour it
Just
like
lightly.
lightly, just because you just can't spend all day doing that.
And are you
Yeah,
using
especially with your volume of
Right.
yeah, what
seriously.
they're working.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
You'd
just
have
gonna take
really
forever.
beefy hands. And are you using tap water, distilled water? What's your preferred?
I just use my well water.
Mhm.
You know, ideally, if you had rainwater, but we don't have it this time of year, you could
Right.
bring in snow in buckets and melt it and
Melt it
have
on the stovetop.
Yeah, if you
Extreme gardening.
totally. If you have a lot of time, you can do that. And it's also nice to get that infusion of kind of rain water. But I've found that uh, it hasn't been an issue with starting seedlings with the well water, even though our water's pretty hard. I think really you run into issues when they get bigger, right? And they're trying to draw more water, they're trying to draw more nutrient when they're
Mhm.
in those 4-inch pots that you might have issues.
Okay.
But well water seems to work just fine. City water, the chlorination in it doesn't seem to be a huge issue, but you could just have a practice of, having water, filling it up, leaving it to gas for 24 hours, and then using it on your
Right,
plants.
yeah, because the chlorinated stuff,
Yeah.
chlorine,
Yeah.
chlorinated stuff, yeah, just degasses.
Yeah.
That's a good thing to mention. That's cool. So, what are so now our plants are germinated. We've got the light on them. We're watering them. At what point do I know that it's time to move them onto a bigger container?
Yeah. So once they've gotten their first true leaves, right? So initially, when a seed germinates, it has its cotyledons, which are those leaves that initially come up. But then,
They're usually round,
yeah,
yeah.
they're kind of round looking. But then it'll produce its true leaves, and that's at that point you can have them grow for a little bit longer, but not that much. At that point, you want to step up, say, a tomato into a 4-inch pot,
Mhm.
for example. With broccoli, you can keep it in a cell this
Mm.
big, but with tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, you want to step it up into something bigger.
So is that kind of like plant family dependent, would you say? Or?
It's yeah, good question. It's a couple things. It's timing more than anything, right? Because the tomatoes, starting them from seed, you got to start them from seed mid to late March, and they got to grow indoors for like 2 months before
Yeah.
you put them out, right? So then they need more soil and nutrient for that. Whereas with broccoli, you can put them out a lot sooner, right? You can put them out 2 weeks sooner, maybe 3 weeks, depending on if you have season extension techniques. So they don't have to grow for as long.
Right.
So that's part of it too.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so
cool.
for tomatoes, are you typically bumping them up to the 4-inch pot and then direct sowing outside? Or not direct sowing, but
Transplanting.
transplanting them directly outside? Or is there a 6-inch pot, an 8-inch pot?
No.
At what point do you decide, let's just put it outside?
No, I just grow them I take them from these little cells into a 4-inch pot, and then they're in the ground.
Okay.
Like, once they get to be robust enough to go. Yeah. So, and that's another thing that you want to consider as a gardener, right? That seed starting is great, but takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, depending on, sometimes for beginner gardeners, I recommend that they just buy seedlings to begin with, and then, buy the seed packets for the things that are direct seeded in the ground, just to eliminate this other step that you take.
Right.
But in an ideal scenario, you're not stepping things up more than once, because then it just becomes too time consuming to do all of this prep work.
As far as I understand it, every time you do transplant, it's very stressful on the plant too,
exactly.
right?
Yeah. So you're disturbing the roots, and so that leads to a little stress on the plant. So if anything, putting it in a 4-inch pot, sometimes you can put, things like broccoli seedlings, you see those 6-packs, right? That size of soil is enough for them, and they don't need to be stepped up at all. I will start my leeks or onions in cells like these.
Okay.
And then this goes into the ground. These cells go into the ground.
Straight from there.
Yeah.
So what about humidity then? Because I see you also have a lid over there.
Right. So you can use the lid. It's like a greenhouse, creating a mini greenhouse. This one got a little beat up by my stepson's dog. But you can use a lid that will make it such that you don't have to water as often, right? Because it maintains more humidity inside.
And it also helps with germination, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it helps with germination because the moisture level is more consistent.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can certainly use something like that. It's kind of like a mini greenhouse, although again, not critical. I sometimes use this, sometimes not, because I find it a little bit cumbersome. But
do you find potential issues with, too much humidity when using something like that? Is that a thing that can happen?
Yes. Yeah. And that's one of the things where, you can experiment a little bit, or, one option is, once you keep this on, once they germinate, you take it off.
Okay.
And you don't use
So what does that look like on, too much humidity? Is it just it's always wet in there?
Yeah, it's too wet, or you see either like some kind of mold growing on there, or it gets kind of greenish. Sometimes the perlite in the soil some algae might be growing on there. So that's a signal that you're either overwatering, right, or something's out of balance. But it's usually that you're overwatering.
Okay.
And I think a lot of times, and this just goes for gardening in general, like, people think that when plants are struggling, it's that they're not getting enough water.
Yeah.
I am super guilty of that.
And usually
this is what you need.
I'm just loving my plant. I love you so much. Please grow. And then they die.
Yeah. And I, admittedly, I'm a great outdoor gardener, like outdoor gardens, food, forest, greenhouse, but my house plants, they struggle, right?
I've got a little pothos back behind the camera there. That's the first one I've ever kept alive.
It looks beautiful.
I've called the garden barn. They're my best friends. Turns out you can send them pictures.
Oh.
Yeah, you
There
can
you go.
text them. So I just text them and say, "Help me.
Right.
I don't know what's happening."
Yeah.
And they go, "You're killing your plant because you're watering it too much."
Because you're watering it too much. Yeah. Same
Yep.
thing.
So
So it's the same with seedlings too. It's
Mhm.
just like the biggest thing the biggest skill that you can develop as a gardener is to observe,
Mhm.
and to accept feedback.
Yeah.
And just always and experiment. But, it is predominantly that you're overwatering is usually the issue.
Do you tend to take notes every year of all of the things that you're trying, or do you just kind of mentally store it away and remember?
Right. I wish I took no more notes than I do. I think a lot of now what I recommend people do, because our cameras are so right
Mhm.
there on our phones, is taking photos.
Right.
And remembering. I know gardeners that have years of data,
That's awesome.
but I don't have time to do that, unfortunately. What I do oftentimes is I will, with the seed starting, I recommend that you have a little label,
Mhm.
because you think you're going to remember what you put, but you don't. Too many other things happen in between. So make sure that you label all of what you've planted. Same with when you step them up into 4-inch pots.
That's a huge tip. When we did the grow bag garden on the patio this year,
We forgot some labels.
we forgot some labels.
Totally.
And it's like, now you got to wait until it's big to,
Yes.
to see what it is.
Yeah, and it is amazing. Like, I think in my head, I'm like, oh, I'll just remember. Or
Yeah.
when I put them in the 4-inch pots, where I'm just trying to transplant stuff as quickly as possible, and I'm like, oh, I'll remember that all of these are this tomato. But then you move things around,
Mhm.
and then I'll give my friends mystery tomatoes at the end. But like, here's a seedling. I've grown too many tomatoes as usual, but I don't know which tomato this is.
Yeah.
But here you go. So labeling is really
And
good.
with something like the grid here,
Mhm.
because there's not much room to really put always
Yeah.
labels. So what I've done is like drawn it out in a sheet of
Oh,
paper and
perfect.
just like
Yeah.
written in each cell what it is.
Yeah.
It's a bit more work, but it helps.
And what I've often done too is, you label, like, that this one row is all the same thing. So
Right.
you just have a label at the top here, or this one row is one, and you have a label that way. And so that seems to work with cells like this. But when because you can't move this around and you can't move the cells around. Whereas when you put them in 4-inch pots and you can start moving those on trays, then that gets a little bit more complicated.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
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 I tend to move things. So
Yeah.
The more labels,
Yeah.
the better. And you can use, I've used like leftover. That's again another opportunity to reuse things from when I used to install gardens for clients. I still have all of the labels from
Mhm.
buying things at a garden center, and I just cut those and put write a Sharpie on there,
Right.
and then you write the date.
Yeah, date's good too.
Dates are important, just especially when you're germinating stuff, so that you can know, oh, I put those seeds in like 3/15, and it's like April 1st or 5th, and nothing's come up.
Mhm.
Then you know that either those seeds are duds and they're too old, right? Or they just have a really low germination rate, or something is wrong.
That's a good point. We didn't really talk about like what's how long should people expect for their seeds to germinate? I think that depends on the type
It
of
depends
plant,
on the type
right?
of seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's anywhere from it's anywhere from, I've had seeds germinate, like cool season crops germinate within like 3 days of seeding it. But sometimes it's 7, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes I think on here it's up to 12,
Okay.
you
Yeah.
know? So, for squash, for example, it's 7 to 10
And it
days.
usually says it on the back of the seed label too.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
right?
yeah. Yeah. So it's and sometimes, and that's where that moisture check is super important in terms of like how quickly things are germinating.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you doing anything with your seeds before you go to put them in the dirt? Like, are you soaking them in paper towels? Are you putting them in the freezer? What are you doing?
Right. So, it'll depend on the seed.
Mm-hmm.
With tomatoes and peppers, I don't. You could again do that,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessary. But things like peas that you direct seed in the soil, I will often soak those for
Okay.
24 hours beforehand because they're bigger,
Does
right?
that just make the shell a bit more
Yeah,
softer?
it makes it such that they're, like, directly absorbing that water,
Mm.
right? And again, they rely on that moisture to germinate, so it just speeds up germination.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we did this past year that I don't know if it really
It didn't make a difference.
did, but we cut. Have you ever seen where you can cut the tip of the seed
Oh, right.
to
Yeah.
like kind of
Yep.
help it get started?
Yeah.
I don't know if we didn't really.
Yeah, we did it with our winter squash, and we did 3 per pot.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I remember exactly where we put them all because it was on the right-hand side. They all came up about the same
About the same time.
about the same time, about the same thickness, and then,
Right.
some of them shot up quicker than others, but it really didn't make that much difference from what I could see.
Yeah, it wasn't like, oh,
Wow, that one's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Right. That's so much
Awesome.
quicker than anything
Yeah.
else. And it again, it's like a time thing too. Is that input in of energy worth the yield out? And that's
Right.
good. Again, experimenting is what you
Mhm.
want to do, right? You experiment and not a noticeable difference. We
Yeah.
don't need
Yeah.
to. We don't need to do that extra step.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you're soaking your pea seeds, are you just taking them, putting them in a big bowl of water? Are you putting them in paper towel that's been soaked? Or
No, just I'll put them in like a, old salsa container or something. And you're oftentimes adding an inoculant
Okay.
to the peas themselves. But yeah, those are actually, now that I think of it, they're probably the only one that I pre-soak regularly.
Okay.
Everything else I usually just put in the ground and
Okay.
Cool. So, I'm doing this for the first time. I got my seeds to finally germinate. A bunch of things can happen from that point until you are actually putting that plant into the ground. So, like growth issues, that's something we wanted to ask you about. Like, what are some common seedling growth issues that people might, run into, and what are there remedies for them? you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is you're going to have them become leggy because they're looking for the light.
Meaning they get real
Yes,
tall.
they get really tall. So when you see, sometimes you'll see that in like a garden center, like for a tomato seedling specifically, right? You want like a robust, bushy, small seedling. You don't want one that's like super tall, right? Because one, it's doing that because it doesn't have enough light. It's doing that probably because it's stressed. You definitely don't want to buy a seedling that already has flowers on it.
It took me a long time to know that.
Right.
I've bought a lot of like, ooh, it's got a tomato on it. I'm
Yes.
going to take this home and
Yes.
it's dead next week. So
Yes, exactly.
been there, done that.
Exactly. And garden centers rely on that, where they're
Yep.
like, sweet, I already have a tomato.
I'm going to
Excellent.
sell this girl a lot of stuff.
She'll be back in a week.
I was absolutely one of those people a few years ago.
And that's totally like, that's what, that's just part of the learning process
Yep.
too, right? But so there's that. There's also something called damping off disease, right? Where suddenly your seedlings are growing, they're super happy, and then you look the next day and they're like, and that is like a disease related thing related to overwatering as well. So those are the two biggest issues that you deal with. The other thing is when you step them up into 4-inch pots, just making sure you get a good potting soil. You want to monitor, right? Because the plant, versus the garden or the grow bag where you have a lot of soil in there and the plant can, draw that nutrient from the soil. In a 4-inch pot, that's it. It's a very, small, discrete amount of soil and nutrient. And so if your seedlings are growing for a while and because it's like still snowing in Montana and you can't put your tomatoes out, you might see kind of yellowing starting on your leaves. And at that point, depending on what the timeline is in terms of when you can actually put those in the ground, you may have to look at using like a liquid fertilizer or some natural fertilizer just to add an additional amount of nitrogen to those growing plants.
To just help with the plant growth, the
Exactly.
tissue growth.
And typically I have, again, it's all about the like potting soil that you choose. I have not had to do that very often. Um and know also that if you're like they're struggling and they look yellow, but you're going to put them in the ground within like 3 or 4 days, no big deal.
Okay.
Like wouldn't worry
They'll
about
kind of recover.
they'll recover.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's cool. So so you mentioned legging, I think you called it.
Legginess? Yeah.
Legginess, getting real tall and the damping off, just to
Yeah.
kind of flopping over. Are there any remedies for that, or is that
The
you just
damping
start
off,
over?
you're done.
Damping
start
off,
over.
dead.
Dead.
Yeah.
Dead.
What a damper.
Unfortunately, you can't remedy that at
Okay.
all. Yeah. So another reason to make sure everything's kind of sterile, to make sure your watering, regime is, consistent.
Mhm.
And where, keep Lindy away when she's like, I want to
water
water
can down.
more.
Put it down.
And at that point, I
Very
mean,
accurate.
it's probably like 2 weeks into the process. For example, you could
Right.
probably still start over.
Right. So for some things, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
For others, again, what I recommend with seed starting too is, and gardening in general, right? Timing is everything. So get your plant. I have a planting calendar for those who are in Montana. Like get that planting calendar to understand when you should start your seed. Start from seed. When should you start your tomatoes? When should you start your peppers? When should you start your leeks or onions and broccoli, right? And then knowing when then all of that gets transplanted outside too. So all of that timing is really super important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. And I did follow your calendar last
Yeah.
year.
Great.
That's on your website, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We
Cool.
can maybe put a link to that
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Cool. So, one more thing, the legging though, is there any remedy for that?
Only, I mean, when things, it's if you notice that they're getting leggy, then the light should be closer.
Mhm.
And then if if you have a greenhouse, moving things out into like natural light
Mhm.
is going to mean that you will have less leggy plants. So, I start everything indoors under lights in the basement. I step things up into 4-inch pots. The tomato seedlings, for example, grow to maybe that high, and then I move them out into the greenhouses as soon as I can, depending on the what's happening outside.
And
Yep.
do you ever I know some people like to take their seedlings and just like leave them out for a few hours, to just
Mhm.
kind of like get them used to the big world out there, you know?
Yes. So you want to do, so you go well, for me, I go basement, greenhouse, and then a few days before you actually put them outside, you want to do what's called harden them off. And so you get them used to, like you said, like, are
They're
you
big work
ready
ants.
for this?
Yeah.
Because it's Montana.
Welcome to
in May.
kindergarten.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you want to get them used to it so there's not that transplant shock
Yeah.
of like, I went from this amazing, beautiful greenhouse or the like basement with these awesome lights and it's super warm to, here's Montana. It's still 45 or 40
Yeah.
degrees at night. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like bringing a fish home from the pet store.
Yeah.
You put the bag in the water first,
There you
let it sit for a few hours, and then you take it out.
Good
There you
analogy.
go.
Yeah.
For all the fish lovers out there.
Yeah.
There you
For
go.
everybody that knows what you do when you bring fish home from the pet store. Like, the most. Well, the people who know will know.
Right, exactly. Maybe a lot of goldfish lovers out there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I think we covered the seed starting pretty well. One thing I wanted to ask you though, and maybe putting you in the spot a bit, but are there any like game changing seed starting hacks that you've kind of learned through experience that maybe people can't just read in a book? Anything that comes to mind in that regard? Something where you're like, oh, I wish I would have read that, but I never really encountered it.
Yeah. I think this cell starting thing for
Mhm.
me, because I did for the longest time, I did use like yogurt containers and other things. And this just kind of made it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Just in terms of labeling it, just in terms of like taking them out and dividing them up and stepping them up. Like that helped a lot. I think the heat mat is a good investment. Some of these other things are not necessary. I mean, other than that, I would say no specific hacks, but yeah, just observe. Just
Yeah.
pay attention. Just pay attention to your seedling. Like they need a lot more attention than your garden, right? Because you think about it, they're like babies,
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Just how like babies need more attention than a toddler, than a teenager.
But they don't need to be watered every day.
But
Yeah. Yep.
until they germinate, they don't
But
need to be
back off
watered.
on the
Yes,
watering.
exactly.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, anything else seed starting related you think we didn't cover that like
Only
people should know?
I do have a video on YouTube where I go through and you can visually see these things a little more, so we can link to that if needed. But no, I think that's pretty good. But like timing is critical, watering is critical, daily observation is pretty critical. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, if we still have time, I'd love to get a little bit into greenhouses.
Sure.
Because I know you
Yeah.
are a big greenhouse person, right? Like,
Yep.
and I think that probably is because we live in a cold climate. Like, I don't even know what zone are we here. There's like
We're USDA hardiness zone 4 B.
4B, yeah.
But it's mostly about the fact that we have, that's, good to know for all of our perennial plants, but it's mostly also because we have a very short growing season for our annual plants. That's, 90 to 110 days, depending on the year.
It's not long.
Yeah.
Which is why for all my squashes and stuff, I was like 80 days, 90 days max. Like,
right.
I was trying to find.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is a great hack, right?
Yeah.
To get those shorter season varieties.
Right. And those, again, you might not find them at the store, so might as well start them yourself. But yeah, greenhouses, what do you love about greenhouses? What is it?
Yeah, season extension.
Season extension, okay.
And growing out robust, healthy seedlings.
Okay.
Yeah, for both of those reasons, I think.
So you think the greenhouse produces stronger seedlings than just putting them straight outside, or?
It produces stronger or let me put it this way, like depending on, if people are deciding whether to have a greenhouse, I would say go back to your goals. Like what are your main goals? And if one of them is I want to start a lot of my stuff from seed, then I would recommend a greenhouse, right? I like it for that reason, because you just have that natural light. It's a contained environment. And in addition to that, I'm not only growing my seedlings out, but I'm growing cool season crops in there early in the season. So I'm getting greens a lot sooner than outside.
Yeah.
Otherwise I'd have to wait so I'm getting greens, at least a month or so earlier, if not more than that.
Which that could be a good amount of produce, right? Yeah. Especially if it's like a lettuce, or they grow pretty quick.
Yes,
so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're just getting to eat from your garden that much sooner.
Right.
And I think that's the thing when people are like, I want to grow, my goal is to grow as much food of my own food as possible. And you're in Montana, well, then you should use some kind of season extension technique, whether it's a greenhouse or frost cloth or cold frame. But of course, a greenhouse would be the choice depending on what your budget is.
When should you start preparing your greenhouse for the season, and what do you do for that?
Yeah, so I usually start about mid to late February. It depends on the year, but probably mid to late February, I will start to shovel snow from outside. In fact, I did that yesterday.
Gotta go find the greenhouse.
Right.
I think it's over in that corner.
Yeah, mid-February or first or week of February, I will first shovel a pathway to the greenhouse, and then I will use that snow and start shoveling it onto the soil in the greenhouse. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you do, even if you're not growing in there, is in like December, January, you still want to make sure that that soil remains moist.
Okay.
Because, of course, soil microorganisms are reliant on there being moisture. And what happens is when you have a greenhouse and the sun is beating down on that soil all the time, right? You're desiccating the soil and it becomes almost hydrophilic.
Mm.
And then soil microorganisms are either have gone dormant or they die. And so keeping that soil moisture in there is important. And or if you're not watering, at the very least, you've watered at the end of the season, say in November, you've mulched it really well with a cap of leaves or something like that so that that soil moisture is still in there.
So greenhouse prep for you almost starts the year before,
Yes.
in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Just kind of like garden prep too, that ideally if you have the time, right, you're putting a layer of compost and some mulch on top of your bed to put it to sleep, so to speak. So same with the greenhouse. Early on, you're doing that in November, and then starting in February, you're really being actively trying to kind of get the whole process going
Right.
again, and clearing out stuff depending on what you're trying to grow in there.
Have you ever tried using your greenhouse year-round to grow food? Is that something you recommend or maybe not so much?
I think at our latitude, I don't really recommend it. I mean, unless you have like a super like in-ground greenhouse or a climate battery in your greenhouse or something like that. I think that it's what in permaculture we call forcing function a little bit.
Mm.
There's so little light in December that things that are growing so slowly
Right.
that the time and effort and possible heat that you're using, like when it gets down to like minus 15 or something to get that greenhouse to produce that's some really expensive spinach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it kind
No
of depends
kidding.
on the kind of greenhouse you have, the latitude that you're at, and how much input you want to put in, but it's probably not worth it. Like for me, sometimes I would prefer, rather than paying the energy company, I'd prefer to pay a local farmer that's running a commercial greenhouse
Right.
anyway. I'll support them and their livelihood rather than me trying to make this thing kind of work.
Force it. Yeah.
The one thing that I would recommend that you could do is if you can keep some of that like spinach going, or if you've had stuff in there kind of in the fall and it's still kind of producing and then it kind of goes dormant, it might like
Come back. Okay.
in the spring, and then you get that much more of a jump start.
Right. Okay.
So
Okay.
there are some ideas, and I would just experiment with it. But I think for the in permaculture, it's about do the inputs in equal the yield out? So does the input of time, energy, fossil fuel energy if you need it, right, and kind of the light, does it make sense to have this spinach salad on your plate in December?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
only that, but like, if you're eating seasonally, which is some of what you are all about, like you
Yeah.
also don't feel like eating salad in
Yeah.
Yeah,
winter,
in the
Yeah.
winter as much.
you know?
Yeah.
I'm
So,
a cozy soup gal in the
yes,
wintertime.
exactly. Squash soup,
Is it
Exactly.
is it possible to grow perennial plants in your greenhouse year after year, or are there any that you really like for that?
It is possible, but then you got to make sure that you are watering in there, right?
Right.
So our perennial plants, even though they go dormant, they still get water, and then
Right.
they still get the insulation of the snow.
Right.
So
Okay.
you just got to be careful that if you have perennial plants growing in there, which people do, right, they just need to be watered and mulched.
Okay.
Got it.
Gotcha.
And for mulch, you usually recommend leaves or
I usually recommend leaves because they're abundant and
Yeah.
free.
Yep.
And then you don't have to worry about whether they've been sprayed or not.
Right.
If you have access to non-sprayed organic straw or hay or something like that, that will work too. And or grass clippings that
Mhm.
haven't been treated at all.
Is
Like
it
all of that.
possible to overdo it with the leaves? Because I know the place that we were at last time, the leaves in the front yard, nothing grew under them because
Mm.
it was just, the cottonwood leaves there's just so many of them.
Yeah.
It's all dead.
Yeah. Yeah, so you definitely can overdo it with leaves. You wanna use mulch, um, it's all about timing,
Mhm.
right? So early on with a garden, if you're direct seeding stuff in your garden and you're watering it, you don't yet put mulch on,
Okay.
right? Or let me put it this way. In the fall, you've prepped the garden, you've put mulch on. In the spring, you pull all that mulch back.
Okay.
You put your seedlings in, you water them, they come up. Once they're up and, growing, then you move the mulch back on.
Gotcha.
Just
Okay.
to keep water, moisture in and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Cool. What about like mold in a greenhouse? Is that something you run into? And is
Not
there,
very often here.
right.
People do though. And
Yeah.
that's again, when they do, then you're overwatering again, right?
Mhm.
A greenhouse does have like an increased level of humidity in it.
Right.
And that's good for the plants, right? They like that. But if you are having mold issues in your greenhouse, again, the balance of water is off.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Is there any treatments that you like that are kind of plant safe for mold?
I don't, you could use, well, it depends on where it is,
Okay.
right? Like, are you thinking it's on
I'm
the
thinking like on the wood siding of the greenhouse
right,
or something.
right,
So not like on your plant
right.
itself, but the wall of the
Yeah,
greenhouse is starting to have a
yeah,
little funky something.
yeah. In that case, I'd probably just do vinegar and water.
Okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what we did in our old place too. The house
Yeah.
had a bit of mold and then
Yeah.
kind of worked. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had no screens or anything on the windows for the longest times. The humidity just,
Oh, wow. Yeah,
it was very humid in that house.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
yeah.
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 Oh, that's crazy.
So, do you have any recommendations in like what type of greenhouse and the material it's built from? Maybe like in general, what do you prefer? And then maybe also in a place like this where there's a lot of snowfall,
Mhm. Yeah.
So a lot of them are pretty flimsy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have there are so many different options in terms of greenhouses. There's anything from like a hoop house that you just cover with plastic film, right? Up to something that is kind of either timber frame or metal that uses twin wall polycarbonate to, a glass
Mm,
structure, right? So with the hoop house, the good thing about a hoop house is that it is um, cheaper,
mm.
but the plastic doesn't last that long and you have to be concerned about snow load. So you have to be out there with the snow that we've been having this season, right? You better be out there pushing that snow off of the roof. Otherwise, it's just going to rip the plastic and
Yeah.
you're, back to starting over, or you have to purchase that plastic again.
Yeah.
With a twin wall, I like twin wall polycarbonate. I have a small 10 by 12 greenhouse that is, you can grow a lot in it, and it has twin wall polycarbonate, and that lasts quite a long time. It's pretty hail resistant and would probably be the material that I would recommend. Glass can be fine for the sides of your greenhouse, but you kind of don't want it for the
Roof.
top of the roof in
Yeah.
case we also have hail.
Yeah.
So I think that if I were to choose in terms of durability and kind of worthwhile and hail proof, it would be the twin wall polycarbonate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess the last question I really had about greenhouses, like supplying it with water. Do you lay hoses over there, or is there a good way to do that?
Yeah, I think it depends on I hand water in my greenhouse, I think because it's small enough and I'm often, watering the seedlings, and so there's like a certain amount of like connection that you want to have
Mhm.
with your plants to make
Right.
sure everything's working well. You can do a drip system in a greenhouse if you want, and have that on a timer. I collect water off of my roof into kind of large 250-gallon IBC totes. A lot of that water is used for the greenhouse because the water, of course, the beds in the greenhouse never see rainwater. So any opportunity that you can have to use rainwater in the greenhouse, I would take it. Now, you could also, I had a client last year, I helped her design her greenhouse, and she collects the water in those IBC totes in the greenhouse. So those IBC totes are in the greenhouse itself
Hmm.
because her greenhouse is attached to a barn. The barn is the roof along which she's collecting that water, and so that you have that availability right there in the greenhouse.
Gotcha.
So you can certainly do that if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
for your greenhouse design, that's good too, because then the water is going to be slightly warmer than if it's just outside.
Right.
Is there collecting rainwater a big part of the permaculture thinking, would you say?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it just the sustainability of it, or is it also like maybe water having its own almost microbiome, you know?
Sure. I think
Like,
it's both. A lot of it is about, the permaculture principle of capturing and storing energy, and this, free water that comes onto your site, and especially in a place like ours where we get so little water,
right.
right? Being able to capture that water in some way, whether it is in cisterns or in a pond and or in a rain garden, actually in the soil, is beneficial. So I think it's just having that resource and being able to use it in a way that's helping us grow food, right? Rather than running off and, I don't know, not doing very much or going into the storm sewer system and then
Yeah.
having to be treated, and, like all of that's in so many ways a dumb design for how we could better use water.
Right.
But yeah, definitely like rainwater catchment, depending on your site and the availability and what your circumstance is a good idea in terms of redundancy, right? I have a lot of clients sometimes, they're like, oh, well, I have, a well, and maybe I have some water rights or something, and that's great. But what if something happens to your well and it's not functioning? What if those water rights, don't hold, or whatever it is? That's water rights always hold, but especially if you're senior water rights. But it just creates another redundancy in your system, which equals resilience,
Right.
right? That the more you can safeguard in the more ways that you can harvest water on your site, that if one of them fails, you're still harvesting water in
Right.
some
Right.
way. And it could be that you're harvesting water by mulching, right? You're conserving, or by growing a living ground cover or growing perennial plants, right? All of those are ways in which you're harvesting water and keeping it in the soil and in the ground rather than having it run off.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. I
Is
like
there anything new in the permaculture world that you're getting really excited about?
There is something called syntropic, and I don't know if it's necessarily new, but syntropic agroforestry, and it's kind of a system of growing that's a successional, an intentional successional system. There are more examples of it in the tropics and subtropics than there are in the temperate climate, but I'm curious about experimenting with that in the temperate climate.
I actually
Okay.
did a whole episode with a guy from Brazil on it.
Oh, great.
I'll have to send that to you.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
He forget his name now, but like we did it all remote, and he's like by his little RV camper van, and yeah, it was a
That's
fun
awesome.
episode. He had it's actually one of the most listened to episodes, I think, like the last year or two. So maybe it is
I
kind of a trendy thing right now.
I think people are, in terms of like soil building, I think it's definitely something that is all the rage. The other thing that I get that I'm very interested in is social permaculture, and that social systems design and the social piece of like, how do you take permaculture principles and apply them to your inner landscape and to your social systems design? Because I don't think
Outside of the garden, even.
outside of the garden, and yet maybe supportive of the garden, of like, okay, you want to grow as much food as possible. Well, you can't just do it alone, because typically, historically, food was not grown by yourself, solo, right? Agriculture was not meant to be a solitary act. So, like, reminding people that agriculture was done in community. And so what does that look like? That looks like work parties. That looks like having your friends over, volunteer days. And then that also looks like enjoying food together.
Right.
And I think that just looking at those aspects and also looking at, permaculture principles as they relate to your own kind of well-being. There are so many different aspects of resilience. Some of it is, can I grow all of my own food? But a lot of it is, mental health. Like we're
Mhm.
in a giant mental health crisis
Mhm.
right now in this country. It's like and the garden can help with that,
Yep,
right? But looking at your life through these permaculture principles can as well.
absolutely.
I like that a lot. Cool. So, last question I really had was, is there like any, maybe an example of a project you did last year or relatively recently where permaculture had like really good success?
Yeah. Well, there's this one client that I talked about that we did an attached greenhouse to her barn. I think she was a student of mine in my resilient homestead program, and she has a lot of slope on her property, but everything's positioned where it should. Like sometimes on permaculture sites, you're like, I wish that this would be wherever. But her house is at the top of the slope. So she can collect water off of her garage roof. And we move that water. We're going to move that water into a food forest area that she'll be growing this year. And then she has annual gardens.
Mm.
And then on her barn, we attached this greenhouse, and then we were able to capture the water off of the barn to be used in the greenhouse, and that will be growing. And she told me that, initially when she started my class, she was like really thinking, "Oh, I'm going to have to, you know, flatten out a lot of areas of my property because it's so sloped."
Right.
And then she discovered, "Oh, like this slope is an asset."
Yep.
Because everything can run down slope and we can be capturing water in these areas and running it down to
Mhm.
other areas. So it just felt like a really well designed, even though, the people that initially designed that space weren't
Thinking about that.
thinking about that. But she's done a ton of work and really started to put the pieces into place, and I'm just really looking forward. That was just 1 year she did all of this stuff. I'm really looking forward to
Mhm.
seeing what happens this coming year.
Do
That's
you
awesome.
do you tend to work with the land as much as possible, or are there any instances where you're kinda, "We gotta battle this hillside, like, this isn't gonna work." W
Right. Well, and I think yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, part of permaculture is all about harmonizing with the natural
Mhm.
patterns of the landscape. Um, and, I think that we try our best to do that in a design. Um, but I've encountered situations, I think it always gets back to your goals, right? The permaculture principle of designing from patterns to details, you have to understand your goals, right? Before you know where you're going to put, if you're going to have a greenhouse and where it might be, right? And so I think sometimes where you run into issues is when perhaps the landscape is like people have bought the wrong place
Right.
for what they want to do.
Okay.
Like they've bought a kind of cabin in the woods and they wanna have cattle,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And that's happened,
Yep.
with a client of mine before where you're like, this was maybe not the right site." Like, there are some things like that where the pattern is just you're gonna be forcing function and you're gonna be too much against the grain
Okay.
and that's what the beauty also of people being clear if they are looking for land, right? Or they're looking for a property to sit down and be really clear on what your goals are
Right.
Mhm.
before before you look for land,
Right.
because that will determine, if you get to a site where you're like, wow, this is great, this is at the top of the slope, I can run all this stuff downhill, that's going to work perfectly,
Mhm.
and or no, this doesn't have
This is a valley of granite
right.
rock with no trees or water. Great.
Right.
I love it.
And there's a certain amount of like soil rehabilitation that we can do, and soil especially, and vegetation, on the scale of permanence are easier to change.
Mhm.
But, think about climate that we can't, I mean, the climate is changing, but we can't really change that, right? Think about slope.
Mhm.
If you can't change that too much and the slope is too much,
Mhm.
right? You might be able to put in swales, but at a certain angle that you can't.
Right.
So you're looking at terracing, and it's all of those things of like, again, is the input in worth the yield out? am I gonna is this reflective if I wanna grow all of my own food, is this the right site?
Right.
Right.
Okay.
I like that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Well, Kareen, that's all I really had. Where can people find you? We kind of plugged some of the things before, but
Yeah.
just let everyone know where they can
Yeah,
get in
so
contact with you.
thank you. Brokengroundpermaculture.com is my website. At Broken Ground is my YouTube channel. And yeah, get in touch if you want to. I have a regular newsletter that I send out with recommendations and resources, but also on my website under the resources page, there are a ton of different videos related to food forests and greenhouses and gardening. So
Lots of good
Awesome.
stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely the newsletter. I enjoy that one a lot.
awesome.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yay. Well,
Great.
thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on and sharing all your tips with us. And I think you actually, don't you do a course on seed starting too? Or do you
I
had one?
I don't do a course. I have my Resilient Homestead
Okay.
program, which is my 4-month kind of deep dive into permaculture and site planning. But I do have the seed starting video.
Video, right?
Yeah.
Which will blend
Yeah.
in. Cool. Awesome.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming
Thank
on again.
you.
Till next
Thanks.
time. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.